Welcome back to Naked History. I'm Dylan, and this is episode 2 of our 250th special, where we're walking through the haunted house of the American experiment and asking what exactly we're celebrating when we celebrate the beginning. Last time, we opened the front door. We found that a revolution was not inevitable, it wasn't tidy, and it was not unanimous. We found colonies pulled into crisis by empire, taxes, war debt, print culture, protest, and political imagination. We found a declaration that was both a weapon and a promise. And we also met the first ghost, the word all. All men are created equal. It's a beautiful sentence, but it's a very dangerous sentence because it is incomplete. So today we leave the front room and walk deeper into the house. The hallway is narrower here. The air feels colder. The wallpaper started doing that thing that old wallpaper does where it looks less like a decoration and more like it's hiding evidence. And ahead of us are several locked doors. Each one has a neat little label. The first one is labor. The next, frontier. Third, domestic life. Fourth, property. Fifth, civilization. And the last one, order. Very, very polite words. The kind of words people use when they're trying to make violence sound like paperwork. Now, behind those doors are the people whose stories make the patriotic version of the revolution uncomfortable. The people who heard the revolution's promises and had every reason to ask, does this include me? And that is our question today. Who was left outside of liberty? Now, the answer is not one group, it's many. Enslaved people, free black people, indigenous nations, women, loyalists, poor farmers and soldiers, and veterans. People for whom the revolution was not just a birth certificate for a nation, but a crisis of survival, opportunity, danger, betrayal, and hope. So, let's take the key and open the first door. Now, this room is quiet at first, and then you hear it. The sound of metal, the sound of work, the sound of breathing. The revolution loved the language of liberty. It spoke of natural rights, tyranny, consent, freedom, oppression, independence, and the sacred right of a people to govern themselves. And all of that language existed in a society where hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved. That's not a side note, that's the room of chains at the center of the house. By 1776, slavery was deeply embedded in British North America, especially in the southern colonies, but not only there. Enslaved labor shaped plantation economies, household wealth, port cities, trade networks, and political power. So when white colonists accused Britain of trying to enslave them politically, actual enslaved people were listening. And honestly, they had every right to look around and say, interesting choice of metaphor, Thomas. Now, pushing the jokes to a side for a second, just because this section needs to be serious, because the contradiction is serious. The revolutionary generation spoke constantly about liberty while many of its leaders enslaved human beings or benefited from systems tied to slavery. That doesn't mean revolutionary language is meaningless, it just means it was contested from the very beginning. Enslaved people were not passive symbols in someone else's freedom story. They were political actors. They listened, they calculated, and they fled. They negotiated, and they fought. They petitioned and resisted. They understood that a war about liberty might create some openings, and the British understood this too. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people owned by rebels if they escaped and joined British forces. This was not pure humanitarianism, but Dunmore was trying to weaken rebellious slaveholders and strengthen the British military position. The Empire doesn't get a halo here, but motives and consequences are not always the same thing. Thousands of enslaved people fled towards British lines during the war. Some of them served with British forces, some worked as laborers or guides or soldiers or support personnel. Some even gained their freedom, and some were evacuated. Some were unfortunately re enslaved, and some were abandoned. Some died from disease, hunger, or exposure in wartime camps. War opened doors, but not every door led to safety. Black patriots also served the revolutionary cause. Some were free black men, some were enslaved men serving in exchange for promised freedom. They served in militias, state forces, the Continental Army, and at sea. They fought in places like Bunker Hill, Rhode Island, and Yorktown. And this complicates any simple version of the revolution as white men fighting for white men's liberty. Black patriots and black loyalists both existed, and both choices made sense. If you were enslaved, the question was not which side had the prettiest slogan, the question was which path might give you or your family a chance at freedom. That's not confusion, that's strategy. Free and enslaved black people also used revolutionary language to press claims. In northern states, black petitioners argued that natural rights and slavery could not coexist. They took the revolution's own words and handed them back like an overdue bill. We said liberty, and we heard you. Now say it again, but without the chains. Now, the revolution did weaken slavery in parts of the North. Gradual emancipation laws emerged in several northern states after the war, but gradual emancipation often meant exactly what it sounds like: slow, limited, and structured around the interests of enslavers as well as the rights of the enslaved. Now, in the South, slavery survived and expanded. The new nation did not resolve slavery, it compromised with it. And that's the polite way of saying the house kept the chains in the walls. So when we talk about the revolution and liberty, we have to ask, liberty for whom? From what? Under whose authority and at whose expense? And those questions were present from the beginning, and the people in this room knew it. The next room should have a map. It doesn't. Or rather, it has too many maps. British maps, colonial maps, French maps, land company maps, speculative maps, maps with confident lines drawn across places whose actual inhabitants might not agree to become someone else's opportunity. This is the room without a map, and it belongs to the indigenous nations of North America. The American Revolution was not simply 13 colonies versus Britain. The version is very, very too small, and it leaves too many people outside the frame. For native nations, the revolution was a crisis of land diplomacy, sovereignty, survival, and competing empires. Indigenous nations were not background scenery, they were sovereign peoples with their own governments, alliances, rivalries, spiritual worlds, military strategies, and long histories. Now, different nations made different choices during the Revolution. Some allied with the British, and some allied with the Americans. Some tried to remain neutral, while some were divided internally over which side to pick. Some made decisions based on long-standing diplomatic relationships, and others responded to the immediate danger. There was no single native response to the revolution. There were many. For many indigenous nations, American independence did not sound like liberation. It was more like under new management. Now, after the French and Indian War, Britain had issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which attempted to limit colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Crown was not doing this out of pure respect for native sovereignty. Britain wanted order, and Britain wanted fewer expensive frontier wars, and they wanted control. Now, still, many colonists hungry for this western land, the Proclamation Line felt like a cage, and land hunger was one of the engines of the revolution. Now, not the only engine, but a very, very powerful one at that. Speculators wanted profit, and veterans expected the land. Settlers wanted farms, and colonial elites wanted access. Families wanted security, and politicians wanted growth. The future of the colonies was imagined westward. The problem from the settler point of view was that people already lived there. A small inconvenience if your moral philosophy has been replaced by a surveyor's chain. For native nations, British power could sometimes function as a restraint on colonial expansion. It was imperfect, and it was selfish, and very inconsistent, but still a restraint. An independent United States threatened to remove that restraint. And that's why some indigenous leaders saw the British Empire as a better strategic choice. Not because the British Empire was cuddly. Empires are usually not known for their emotional warmth, but because a British victory might slow the flood of settlers into native homelands. But the revolution tore through native communities. In the north, the Iroquois Confederacy was strained and divided by the war. Some nations and leaders aligned with the British, some aligned with the Americans. Some just tried to stay out. The conflict brought raids, retaliations, burned towns, and a refugee crisis. In the South, Cherokee communities faced devastating campaigns and internal divisions. Along the frontier, violence was intimate and brutal. Farms, towns, and families were all attacked. Retaliation bred retaliation. And this was not only a war of ideals, it was a war on the ground. And the ground belonged to someone. When American independence succeeded, many native nations faced a new republic eager to expand. And the Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the U.S.'s independence and gave the United States claims to the land east of the Mississippi. But native nations had not simply surrendered their sovereignty because Britain signed a treaty in Europe. And that distinction matters because the United States claimed territory, but indigenous nations defended homelands. And those two realities collided again and again. The Room Without a Map teaches us that America was not born onto empty land. It was born into a continent full of nations, full of communities, full of fields, towns, hunting grounds, rivers, sacred places, trade routes, and diplomatic relationships. A new republic's liberty came carrying surveyor tools, and the House was already planning additions. Now, the next door is not locked with iron, it's locked with expectations. Inside are kitchens, sick rooms, ledgers, spinning wheels, letters, farms, workshops, and households under strain. This is the room of domestic revolutions. And no, we're not doing the version where women appear only as founder wives standing nearby with supportive cheekbones. Please and thank you. Women are not the decorative accessories to the revolution, they were political participants. They were laborers, organizers, writers, producers, consumers, survivors, and critics. The revolution did more than just enter the continent, it entered households. Boycotts depended on household labor. If colonists refused British goods, someone had to produce alternatives. Homespun cloth became political. Tea drinking became political. Shopping became political. And consumption became a battlefield. And much of that world ran through women's labor. Women organized boycotts, they spun cloth, they managed homes, farms, and shops while the men were away. They raised money for the war effort and they supported the soldiers while gathering supplies. They nursed the sick and the wounded. They passed on information and wrote letters full of political insight. Some of them followed armies as camp followers, performing essential labor such as cooking, washing, sewing, nursing, and hauling supplies. That term, camp follower, may sound dismissive now, but armies depended on that work. Armies throughout history do not run on speeches, it runs on labor. And much of it during the Revolution was women's labor. And the Revolution loved women's sacrifice. It was significantly less enthusiastic about women's authority. And there's a pattern. Women were praised when they served the cause. They were admired when they endured hardship. They were celebrated when they represented virtue, sacrifice, and patriotic domesticity. But when it came to formal political power, like votes or office holding or legal independence, well, suddenly the revolution got very, very shy. Abigail Adams famously told John Adams to remember the ladies as new laws were being made. She warned that men would be tyrants if they could, which is both political theory and one of the better marital subtweets in American history. And John Adams didn't exactly go sprinting towards gender equality. Now, married women generally lived under covenanture, a legal framework that folded a wife's legal identity into her husband's. Property rights, contracts, wages, and legal standing were all limited. Women's political influence usually had to come through informal channels, through family correspondence, household management, community pressure, and print. And still, women pushed. Mercy Otis Warren wrote political drama and history. Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved and later freed black poet, wrote in ways that forced readers to confront race, liberty, faith, and intellect. Esther DeBert Reed helped organize women's fundraising for soldiers. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and served in the Continental Army. And those are just the names that survive well in the record. And many more women labored anonymously. History loves a famous name because it gives the textbook somewhere to stand. But most revolutions are carried by people whose names don't get statues. Women's experiences also differed sharply by race, class, region, and legal status. Enslaved women faced far worse war through the combined violence of slavery, gender, sexual exploitation, family separation, labor, and military disruption. Indigenous women faced attacks on towns, food systems, kinship networks, and sovereignty. Loyalist women could face exile or confiscation, harassment, or the loss of community protection. Poor women faced inflation, scarcity, hunger, and survival without the ceremony. After the war, the new republic developed the idea of republican motherhood. Women were important, the argument went, because they could raise virtuous sons for the republic. And that did open some arguments for women's education, but it also kept women's political value tied to service. Congratulations, you are essential to the republic. Please remain in the approved seating area. Now, the room of domestic revolutions remind us that a society can depend on women's political labor while denying that women are political actors. The revolution did not leave the household untouched. It just pretended the household was not a part of the government. Now, the next room is uncomfortable, but for a different reason. This is the Loyalist room. In patriotic memory, Loyalists get often reduced to cartoon villains, to snobs or cowards or British bootlickers. People standing in red coats saying, actually, tyranny has excellent table manners. But Loyalists were actual humans, and that makes things a lot more complicated. Some Loyalists were wealthy elites tied to royal government, imperial trade, or Church of England authority. Some held offices under the crown, and some feared losing property or influence if independence seceded. But many were ordinary people trying to survive a crisis. Some people believed that loyalty to the king was the lawful and moral position. Some valued the stability of the empire, and some feared that the rebellion would lead to disorder, mob rule, confiscation, or violence. And here's the uncomfortable part. They were not inventing those fears. Patriot mobs did intimidate opponents. Loyalists could face harassment, public humiliation, tarring and feathering, imprisonment, property destruction, and exile. Communities split, churches split, and families split. The revolution was not only Americans versus British, it was also Americans versus Americans before American had one agreed meaning. Now, in some places, the revolution was a civil war, a neighbor against neighbor conflict, brother against brother, parent versus child, old grudges suddenly dressed up in political colors, local conflicts intensified by an imperial war. And loyalism itself was not just one thing. For some enslaved people, the British offered a better chance at freedom than patriot slaveholders did. For some indigenous nations, the crown seemed like a possible restraint on settler expansionism. And for some merchants, imperial ties mattered a lot more. For some religious minorities, local patriot politics felt very threatening. And for some recent immigrants or frontier communities, neutrality or loyalty seemed safer than rebellion. Loyalists were not all noble. Patriots were not all noble. This is why history ruins bumper stickers. After the war, tens of thousands of loyalists left the United States. Some went to Canada, or back to Britain, or into the Caribbean, or other parts of the British Empire. Some lost property, and some rebuilt in exile. Some stayed and tried to reintegrate into communities that did not easily forget. The black loyalists faced a particularly hard road. Some evacuated with the British and gained freedom, but that freedom would come with poverty, broken promises, discrimination, and displacement. Some eventually became part of settlements in Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone, and their story shows again that the revolution's meaning depended on where you stood. The Loyalist room is important because revolutions do not only create winners and losers in neat categories, they tear through relationships. They force people to choose under pressure, and they make people gamble on futures that they cannot see. And then later, the winning side writes the holiday speeches. The last room today is smaller. The furniture is rougher. There's a worn uniform over the chair. Tax notices are on the table, land papers, debt records, a pair of boots, too much road in them. This is the poor man's room. Because the revolution was not only fought by famous founders and gentlemen in assembly halls, it was fought by farmers, by laborers, by artisans, sailors, apprentices, tenants, substitutes, volunteers, conscripts, and men whose relationship to liberty often came with a pay dispute. Ordinary soldiers endured cold, the hunger, the disease, poor supplies, long absences, danger, and uncertainty. They were promised pay, land, pensions, and honor, and they did not always receive those things fully or even on time. Sometimes they received paper money that lost value faster than confidence in a committee. The Continental Army struggled constantly with money and supplies. Congress would declare independence, but paying for it was another hobby entirely. States had competing obligations, and inflation surged, so the soldiers went unpaid. And so the families suffered while men were away. For poorer Americans, the revolution could be both inspiring and devastating. Some believed deeply in the cause, and some wanted more democratic politics. Some had hoped independence would mean fairer treatment, broader rights with debt relief or access to land. Some fought because they were pressured. Some fought because they were paid. And some fought because their communities demanded it. The motives are usually mixed, as humans are usually. Now, after the war, economic distress did not vanish. Farmers faced debts and taxes, courts pursued collections, and property could be seized. So the veterans came home to hardship. People who had fought a revolution against distant power now found themselves squeezed by local creditors and state governments. That's one of the reasons why Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts in the 1780s. Farmers, many of them veterans, protested debt collection, taxes, and the court actions. To elites, this looked like dangerous disorder. To the protesters, it looked like a republic failing the people who had fought for it. The poor man's room reminds us that political liberty does not automatically solve economic inequality. You can overthrow a king and still come home to a sheriff at your door. You can fight for independence and still lose the farm. You can help build the house and still not get a key. So, now the doors are open. The house is getting louder. The ghosts are not vague anymore. They have names, they have claims, they have grievances and receipts. In the room of chains, enslaved people heard liberty language and pursued freedom on their own terms. In the room without a map, indigenous nations faced a revolution that threatened to transform settler freedom into continental expansion. In the room of domestic revolutions, women made boycotts work, sustained households, supported armies. They wrote, organized, and sacrificed, and watched the new republic praise their virtue while limiting their authority. In the Loyalist room, families split. People chose empire, order, freedom, and survival, or restraint, for reasons more complicated than patriotic memory likes to admit. In the poor man's room, soldiers and farmers learned that independence did not cancel debt, or hunger, or taxes, or class power. This is not the anti American version of the revolution. This is the adult version. A version big enough to hold ideals and exclusions at the same time. A version that understands liberty was not handed down complete from a balcony. It was argued over, fought over, withheld, demanded, expanded, betrayed, and reclaimed. The American experiment promised liberty, but promises, like houses, need maintenance. Now, before we leave these rooms, I do want to ask you something. What locked room were you not shown? What part of the revolution did your school version skip, or soften, or sweep into a footnote with the confidence of someone hiding laundry before company arrives? Was it slavery and the revolution, or indigenous sovereignty, women's political labor maybe? Loyalists as actual people instead of powdered wig villains? Or soldiers and veterans coming home to debt after helping build a country that immediately handed them paperwork? Because one of the reasons I wanted to do this special is that American history is too often taught like a house tour where half of the doors are politely closed. You get the grand entryway, you get the portraits, you get the famous table, and you get the good china. But nobody says, hey, before you leave, would you like to see the room where the promise started arguing with reality? And that room matters. Actually, all of these rooms matter. So if this episode made you think of a story, or a person, a contradiction, or a question you wish more people knew about, send it to me. Comment, message, email, carrier pigeon with citations, whatever works. I want to know what part of the American house you think deserves more light. And if this series is doing what I hope it's doing, share it with someone who likes history complicated, honest, and just a little bit haunted. Send it to the friend who loves the revolution, the friend who hates patriotic bumper sticker history, or the friend who still thinks loyalists were just British NPCs waiting to be defeated. Also, follow Naked History, so you don't miss the final episode of this 250th special, because next time we're leaving the locked rooms and we're heading downstairs. In episode 3, we go into the basement, where the house keeps its machinery. Debt, law, expansion, borders, and nationalism, and the memory of war. That is where we ask what happened after independence, when the revolution had become a government, when liberty started moving west, when treaties were broken, and when myths get polished, and when the founding contradiction finally came back with a canon. So thank you for listening. And as always, I've been Dylan, and this has been Naked History. We'll see you in episode 3. Make sure to bring your lantern. It gets especially dark. Have a good one.